we're talking, so that clock is about 5 minutes behind. So we both looked down at our phones and saw it was time. So we'll try to get started this morning. As Mr. Dempsey announced on Wednesday night, we're going to begin the study of the Psalms over the next 4 months. And four of us, each of us has 4 to 5 Psalms to cover, starting with a couple Messianic Psalms. We'll have 2 of those. And we kind of just keep dividing them out, and we'll go through different sets of Psalms here. The first one we'll begin with this morning is Psalm 89. It's a rather lengthy Psalm, probably take about 2 weeks to cover this. And then paired with it, as far as the Messianic Psalm, will be Psalm 110. So kind of teach those in a set, and then move on to a couple more after that. So looking at the Psalms, I kind of always like to do some research about the actual Psalm, the author, before we get into it, because I always feel like that helps me to understand and get a better grasp of kind of the true meaning of the Psalm, if I can kind of understand the background of it and understand where it came from. And so this Psalm 89 was actually the last Psalm in the 3rd book of the Psalms. So the Psalms were broken down into 5 different books, and this was the last one of that. As far as the time frame when it was written, we know that it's ascribed to the author Ethan. And Ethan, an Ezrahite, from what we can tell, is he was a Levite. He was a son of Keshiah, and that comes from 1 Chronicles chapter 15, verses 17 through 19. In that passage there, this is when David is making his second attempt to bring the Ark of the Covenant back to Jerusalem. And during this time, he has singers and musicians and this great procession to bring the Ark of the Covenant in. And Ethan is one who is mentioned as being one of the singers during this time frame. So just given off of that, obviously we know that he lived around the time of David and through the time of David. And then also it seems like the way that this psalm is broken down, that Ethan was probably advanced in years whenever he actually penned this particular psalm, because he starts with the first portion of it where it's a very joyous, rejoicing portion of the psalm, and then it goes to a very melancholy phase where he talks about kind of some of the destruction and the downfall of the throne and just downfall of Israel in general, which we know did not happen during the reign of David. So that's kind of what tends to think that he was probably a younger man during David's reign. And then, once Israel did start its eventual descent, that's when he penned this psalm. And some have speculated that it was written as far as like during King Zedekiah and during the Babylonian captivity, but I only found one source that kind of leaned towards that. So I'm kind of leaning away that was the outlier, as the time when it was written. So most likely during the reign of King Rehoboam, David's son. And what we'll see a lot in this psalm, a lot of psalms, they'll start off in kind of despair and then they turn to joy and hope. But again, this one has that opposite effect, to where it starts off with the rejoicing and then goes into that lamenting type phase before kind of picking back up in the last couple verses. Let's see, anything else on that? And like I said, this is a messianic psalm. So what is a messianic psalm? It's a good way to describe that. But who does that point towards, the messianic psalms? It points towards Christ. Yeah, it points towards the Messiah. And this one in particular is really going to focus on God's covenant with David. So it can be a Davidic psalm and a messianic psalm, kind of all lumped into one. And we'll read some of that back in 2 Samuel chapter 7 here in a little bit, where God actually makes his covenant with David and kind of flows through the writer, as the writer goes through here. So like I said, the first 37 verses, that is the joy and praise portion of this psalm, where we see this glorious positive reflections on God's grace, his mercy, power, and the promises that he's made to David. And then the psalm goes into like I said, the more melancholy section, lament, sadness, and complaints, petitions, kind of all wrapped into a few verses 38 through 51. And that section, it almost seems like the psalmist feels like that God has broken his great promise with David, and like throughout the generations, throughout the lineage, due to the wickedness, not anything due to God just saying, I don't want to do this anymore, but he feels abandoned almost through this. And we see the psalm, it has this utterance of a believer in the presence of this great national disaster. And we can think about how it must have felt for those who saw the glory of David's kingdom and lived through Solomon, saw these wonderful reigns, and then the destruction and kind of the downfall. We can only imagine what it might be like in our own country if we kind of see, I say things are good, and things are much better than what it certainly could be. But you can just imagine what it would look like if all of a sudden this nation was under siege by some foreign power, or if we're in like a truly great turmoil. How we can go back from seeing really good times, really good days, to being under this great distress, how that might affect our mood, it might affect our relationships with one another, and ultimately just the way that we have an outlook on life. So, that seems to be where the author is at during this time. But he's also urging God to deliver and remember this covenant. He knows that God is a true God, that is a just God, and will keep his promise. But it seems to be having this great urgency and urging God for that. When we think about the covenants, covenants are key to Christianity. What are some covenants we think about that we know of that God has made and throughout the Bible?
Covenant with Abraham.
Yeah, Abraham. That was one of the first ones that I thought about. And back Genesis chapter 3:15. Read that real. Yeah, so Genesis chapter 3:15 through 17 here. I'm sorry, chapter 12, verses 1 through 3. I was like, I know that doesn't sound right. I was like, that was something else that I had. Yeah, so 12, 1 through 3. Now the Lord said to Abraham, go forth from your country and from your relatives and from your father's house, the land which I will show you. And I will make you a great nation. I will bless you and make your name great. And so you shall be a blessing, and I will bless those who bless you, and the one who curses you, I will curse. And in you, all the families of the earth will be blessed. So we see, that being one of the first great covenants, and kind of everything else is built on this. Even the Davidic covenant is built based on that promise. That's where we see God starting to fulfill that, and fulfill it all throughout David's lineage, and then ultimately the culmination through Christ. So it is really amazing how the Bible it has this, I guess, a trueness of God's nature and his character, how we can see way back in Genesis all the way through scriptures where God is true, God is just, and he fulfills everything. Mr. Dempsey?
Yeah, there's something going on in verse 46. It's already it says, how long, Lord, wilt thou hide thyself forever? Will thy wrath burn like fire? Remember what my span of life is, when you understand. Remember that, in other words, I'm not here very long.
Yes.
My vanity, duration, God has created all the sons of men. What vanity was? Yeah, so something's going on, some kind of trial.
Right.
Is going on in the life of Israel. Like I said, we don't know the time period for sure, but there's some kind of trial. David has made known the promises God made known to him, to the people. And they're clinging to that like a dog on bone. I mean, they just, this is it, and
right.
Made this promise, and we know you're going to fulfill it. So whatever the trial is, it's like, remember this promise,
Mm-hmm.
They, like a bee on honey, they just won't let go of that.
Right.
And that is so important to them.
Yeah.
And eventually one will come to bless all nations.
Yes. And without hope, what does one really have, especially in times of trial? Yeah. And obviously, throughout the many generations, the nation of Israel dealt with many, many trials. And we can see, that's why faith in God in our own lives can be so important, is because without hope, trials will come for every single one of us. They have come for all of us. But without that hope, then it can be very, very challenging to endure those trials. Yes. And so something else with these covenants is, Christ, again, being the culmination of that. Think that without Christ, there is no Christianity, and we have no hope without Christ. And through these, so really, we can't really understand God's dealing with his creation and without understanding his covenants. And we can't understand, in understanding how God maintains those covenants and how God's faithfulness, that's going to be one of the keys that comes through this first part of the section is God's faithfulness, how the author just mentions that over and over. And we see throughout the entire recorded scriptures, God's faithfulness, and we still see it working today, in our own lives, this is faithfulness. So, all right, any other thoughts before we kind of dive in a little bit more? Another kind of theme throughout the Psalms that we'll see here is this idea of a servant king, which is a very foreign concept, especially in this day. When you think of a king, I always think of obviously a ruler. You don't think of the king as being the servant. Typically, the king is the one who is served. It's kind of this hierarchy and class system that you have. So it's very contradictory to our nature, but yet, like in verse 3, David is referred to as a servant David. So we'll see all throughout this how David, yes, he is king. Yes, he is king over Israel, but David knows his place. He is lower than God. He is still ultimately a servant to the Most High God, who has anointed him and allowed him to get to this position. And so it just kind of helps to keep everything in perspective as far as a hierarchy there. Right. 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 Yeah. Yeah. And, you think about, pride. Obviously, a lot of times whenever you are at a position of king or some type of very high figure, it's very easy to be arrogant and proud of that position. So to kind of be put into a servant's mentality, again, it's very contradictory to human nature, it seems like. And you think about God chose David. He is just not somebody that we'll talk about firstborn and some things like that later on. But obviously God knew David's heart, and he knew what type of person he needed to fulfill or to make this covenant with. And he knew what David's heart was like, and to have this type of servant king, obviously David fit these characteristics that God desired. Yeah. And David, throughout all this, obviously, we're going to see him as a type for Christ. And Christ being king, he was a servant. He came to serve, and came to serve and to be a sacrifice for us. And so that's how we kind of can see some of these relationships, them going together. And let's flip over now, since we've been talking about this covenant, to 2 Samuel chapter 7, verses 12 through 17. This is actually where God, through Nathan, he has made this covenant to David. This kind of before this is where David was planning to build a temple. He knew that he had this great house of cedar, and yet the Ark of the Covenant was still sitting in a tent. So he goes, he speaks with Nathan. Nathan's like, yes, absolutely, go do this. And then that night, the word of the Lord comes to Nathan, and God says, this wasn't my plan. This is not what I wanted to have done, was for you to build this temple. But then we pick up here in verse 8. So 2 Samuel chapter 7, verse 8. It says, now therefore, thus you shall say to my servant David, thus says the Lord of hosts, I took you from the pasture, from following the sheep, to be a ruler over my people Israel. I have been with you wherever you have gone, and have cut off all your enemies from before you. And I will make you a great name, like the names of the great men who are on the earth. I will also appoint a place for my people Israel, and I will plant them, that they may live in their own place, and not be disturbed again. Nor will the wicked afflict them any more as formerly. Even from the day that I commanded judges to be over my people Israel, I will give you rest from all of your enemies. The Lord also declares to you that the Lord will make a house for you. When your days are complete and you lie down with your fathers, I will raise up your descendants after you, who will come forth from you, and I will establish this kingdom. He shall build a house for my name, and I will establish the throne of his kingdom forever. I will be a father to him, and he will be a son to me. When he commits iniquity, I will correct him with the rod of men and the strokes of the Son of Men. But my loving kindness shall not depart from him, as I took it away from Saul, whom I removed from before you. Your house and your kingdom shall endure before me forever. Your throne shall be established forever. In accordance with all of these words and all this vision, so Nathan spoke to David. So here throughout this section, we see God's actual covenant being made with David. And when David hears from God, he goes from the fields, it's kind of a lowly shepherd servant type position. We don't think being out in the field, especially during this time, it wasn't a very glamorous, glorious job to have. It goes from tending sheep to being anointed king of Israel. And we see there was quite a bit of strife and turmoil that came with that, especially in the immediate years afterwards. But he is still exalted to this position of king, given this covenant, but also is, but it's again still is that servant and servant to the Most High God. Any thoughts about anything within the covenant first, Mr. Reddy?
It's interesting to notice how David reacted to this covenant that God made with him, which is found in the latter part of the chapter, starting verse 18, this prayer. And when you read that, it almost looks like Psalm 89 is an echo of what David had prayed. His reaction is the same that the psalmist has, perhaps many years later.
Right. Yeah. And that might not be a terrible. I don't know if we have time to read it all. Yes, but go back and read, like Mr. Reddy was saying, and it does parallel very well. I'm afraid in order to get everything in these 4 weeks, I don't really have time to go back and read that. But yes, it does. There are so many parallels from those verses. And something else I found that was really amazing is the same wording and the same kind of thoughts all throughout the Psalms. And they were written by these different authors, different times, and yet how they all flow and they all mesh into this one central theme a lot of times. So it was really impressive.
One other thing here, Grant, is that verse 15 of 2 Samuel 7, when he makes this promise, he makes it clear that I know in your family line, there's like 20 kings, there's a long dynasty.
Yeah.
That some of them are going to be bad, they're going to be evil, they're not going to trust in you. He said, but that won't change my promise.
Yeah.
He makes that very clear. This is going to happen. When they do bad, I'm going to punish them. And there will be consequences, but my promise will stand firm.
Yeah.
And so again, that Psalm 89 is clinging to that. No matter what happens, his whole nation says, one man, whatever it may be, God is going to his promise to them.
Yeah. Right. Yeah.
Saul, he did that. God removed that. One man dies. And David is going on until the captivity.
Right. Yeah, and like I said, we see the resolve of God and the careful selection that was made in how we should make, anytime we make a decision as well, you got to be careful about the things you make, but to be resolved once we make some type of decision. And obviously nothing we could ever make would be as significant as this, but still something we can take out. All right, so we'll kind of get into Psalms 89. And yeah, so the psalmist here, whenever he begins by affirming his belief in the faithfulness of God. Throughout the first, specifically 8 verses, we will see faithfulness reaffirmed several times, 4 times, I believe, to the Lord and the Lord's covenant and to the house of David. So we'll begin by reading the first 2 verses. So Psalm 89, it says, I will sing of the loving kindness of the Lord forever. To all generations, I will make known your faithfulness with my mouth. And I have said, loving kindness will be built up forever. In the heavens, you will establish your faithfulness. So even here, we see 2 times faithfulness. This a joyful section where the psalmist is giving praise to God and taking comfort in God's mercy, and he sees the truth in God. So I guess one of the questions can be asked is do we have the same hope that the psalmist has in God's faithfulness in our own lives? That's something that we have and should have. I said earlier, if we don't have that foundation built upon, then whenever there are these difficult times that come, then we can be easily shaken, easily swayed to fall away from God. Yeah.
We don't have to keep in mind. Keep having patience, back. Watch it to just like
Right. Right. Yeah. Right. Yeah. Yeah. And that's really hard. Like you said, when your back's kind of against the wall, that just God has proven time and time again and shown his faithfulness, and he has shown his resolve. But it is very difficult, especially whenever we face trials of our own, to not want to kind of take things in our own hands and really, I guess, be foolish enough to think that we have the ability to carve our own path. And we do to an extent, but it's, as Jared said, pray to God that he makes that path straight and corrects us, keeps us on course throughout that time. But if we keep our eyes focused on him, our eyes focused on the hope we have through Christ, then that's what can ultimately guide us to the correct direction. Because I guess we can forge our own paths, but we'll probably end up in a thicket somewhere. So it's just not gonna go where we want it. Yeah. All right, we'll go to the next couple of verses, 3 and 4. It says, I have made my covenant with my chosen, and I have sworn to David, my servant, I will establish your seed forever and build up your throne to all generations. So God is reaffirming, or here we see God's covenant with David reaffirmed. In those who knew this psalm, typically it was set to a tune, so it would be sung at special events, occasions. They would be very, very familiar with this covenant of David. This is not something that would be new to the Israelites who would be singing this and understanding this. So we just see the psalmist reaffirming this. And then we also see allusions to the coming Messiah without directly mentioning Jesus here. But the steadfastness of God, it sets the tone for the entire psalm, or at least the first portion of this psalm. And that's something that, depending on whatever type of national crisis again was going on at this time, that they really have to be focused on is the steadfastness of God, no matter what is happening. All right, and so any thoughts? So 5 through 8, then the heavens will praise your wonders, O Lord, your faithfulness also in the assembly of the holy ones. For who in the skies is comparable to the Lord? Who among the sons of the mighty is like the Lord? A God greatly feared in the council of the holy ones, and awesome above all those who are around him. It says, O Lord, God of hosts, who is like you, O mighty Lord? Your faithfulness also surrounds you. So twice more here we see God's faithfulness referred to. And here we see the glory and the perfection of God being praised by not only the psalmist, but also those in the heavens, it's really all the heavenly beings. And the imagery that we see here of the gathering of the heavenly beings, praising God for his faithfulness. No one would understand true nature and that glory of God than those heavenly beings actually witnessing God and being around God, worshiping God. But so we would still see the psalmist using this imagery. And there's just no comparison to the Lord in this faithfulness. And in 7, we see, due to his faithfulness, this reverence that he is being held in this reverence of those around him. And I think about go back to the Exodus story, about how the Israelites trembled and feared just when they heard the voice of the Lord after they were leaving Egypt. They didn't want it anymore. Like, no, don't, telling Moses, we don't want to hear from him anymore. They were so terrified at this voice of the Lord. They wanted him to kind of intercede and speak with God on their behalf. Just think of that power, that might that they must have experienced, to where that wasn't even there wasn't anger, rage, anything like that coming directed towards them. This was just God speaking, but yet that still terrified them so much that they had that type of a response. But yet how quickly they lost that fear and reverence for God, and because it didn't take them long to lose that. So that can kind of be a warning to us, I feel like, that how quickly we can also lose our fear and faith in God if we don't diligently keep focused. Any thoughts on that? Now this next section, 9 and 10, I'll read it and then we'll talk a little bit about it. So it says, you rule the swelling of the seas when its waves rise, and you still them. You yourself crush Rahab like the one who's slain, and you scatter your enemies with your mighty arm. This verse 9, I couldn't help but to think about in Luke chapter 8, verse 22. Flip over there, I'll read that. It talks about stilling the waves. So Luke 8:22, and I'll read through 25. It says, now on one of those days, Jesus and his disciples got into a boat, and he said to them, let us go over to the other side of the lake. So they launched out, but as they were sailing along, he fell asleep, referencing Jesus. And a fierce gale of wind descended on the lake, and they began to be swamped and to be in danger. And they came to Jesus, and they woke him up, saying, Master, Master, we are perishing. And he got up, and he rebuked the wind and the surging waves, and they stopped and became calm. And he said to them, where is your faith? They were fearful and amazed, saying to one another, who then is this, that he commands even the winds and the water, and they obey him? And his disciples, they would be familiar with Psalms 89. And when I first read verse 9, just thinking about how God rules the swelling of the seas and the waves rising, how that may have been in their minds. I don't know, it may not have been, but that was kind of one of the first things that came to my mind. About whenever they think this horrible storm could overtake us, we could all drown and die here out on this lake, and yet God or Jesus just wakes up, calms it, and that's it. He was sleeping through it the entire time, and then just they're amazed and how it strengthened their faith so much more. So I don't know, like I said, it was just something I thought about there, and how his disciples may have thought about that. Then the next portion is Rahab. Anytime I hear Rahab, I always think of Rahab, Joshua, Jericho, but that's not who it's actually referring to here. And there is so much commentary written on this one verse and connecting everything to Rahab. I spent hours just going down these rabbit holes, and so I'm gonna try not to do that right now because I don't have the time for it, but it was really amazing. So Rahab in reference here is referring to Egypt. It says, you yourself crush Rahab like the one who is slain and scattered your enemies with your mighty arm. And so Rahab is a personification of Egypt. And it can, some of the commentaries I was reading, there's this Canaanite myth of this great sea monster who was named Rahab. And it seemed like that was personifying them. Again, that's where it kind of takes into the cultural context of it. They would be from the initial singers, or people who are, repeating this psalm, they would be familiar with some of these Canaanite myths more than what we are, obviously. But that's where it's making reference to it. And we see in Isaiah chapter 30, verse 7, it says, even Egypt, whose help is vain and empty, therefore I have called her Rahab, who has been exterminated. And in Job chapter 26, verse 12, It says, with his power, he quieted the sea. By his understanding, he shattered Rahab. We know Job being one of the earliest authors and earliest books. We see that Rahab is similar, possibly to the sea monster Leviathan. Those are where the parallels come into play. And then Isaiah chapter 51, verse 9, who refers to cutting Rahab into pieces. And it says, we see mighty Egypt could no more resist God than the body of a dead animal being crushed. So here are multiple allusions to it, to Rahab again being referenced to Egypt. And we think about how great, powerful Egypt was and Pharaoh was with their armies, chariots, yet God was still able to crush them with the Red Sea. When Moses led the people through the children of Israel through the Red Sea, they were physically crushed with the water coming back down upon them. I was going to read in Exodus 15, verse 3 real quick. So Exodus 15:3, it says, the Lord is a warrior, the Lord is his name. Pharaoh's chariots and his armies he cast into the sea, and the choicest of his officers are drowned in the Red Sea, and the deep covers them. They went down to the depths like a stone. Actually, keep reading through 6, and it says, your right hand, O Lord, is majestic in power. Your right hand, O Lord, shatters your enemies. This concept of a right hand, we'll see the author again playing off of that term, the right hand, here in the next few verses. But it's just showing just this power and this awesome might of God. And the psalmist is reminding them of this and kind of proclaiming this amazing power that God has.
And that's exactly right. All of this is being said, and it's the same point we make over and over again. His power is unlimited, cannot measure. But the main principle here is a God who has that kind of power and knowledge and wisdom also has the power and wisdom to keep his promises.
Mm-hmm.
And I think that's the main thing, is that when you read of God, when you learn anything about God, you know he will do what he says. And that all those things in Job, chapters 38 through 41 there, that's said for one primary reason, that is, Job, I made all that. I can make it and I can destroy it. And so, who are you questioning me? I'm the potter, you're the clay. I'm God, you're not. And so I just want you to remember your place, your role, my place. Whatever I say, that's what I'm going to do.
Right.
I think that's a great point.
Yeah. And we see the restraint of God also when he has this great power, but yet, like I said, in order to keep his covenant, showing that restraint, using a rod instead of a sword. We'll see, talk about some of that imagery or the difference in the language. Yeah, that's a great point. Anybody else with comments about any of that? Let's see if I had anything else on that. So now, y'all are much smarter than I am. So I'm just going to bring this up and see, did this tie into anything? So with this crushing, I'm wondering, with the crushing of Egypt and some of this language, was that foreshadowing any of going back to Genesis chapter 3:15, whenever we were talking about the serpent, 3:15, I will put enmity between you and the woman, and between your seed and her seed, and he shall bruise your head and you shall bruise him on the heel. So is there any of this crushing imagery that can be kind of foreshadowing the head, like Golgotha, place of the skull, crushing as far as Christ? Is there more of a tie with Christ in there than what I made? Like I said, I'm yielding to those that are much smarter. I read a couple commentaries where it kind of was pointing towards that, but I didn't really make that full connection. Has anybody else ever made a connection like that?
I think it's kind of a theme throughout the Bible. There are a couple of things here that are kind of running theme through the Bible. First of all, you mentioned ruling the raging sea and being able to still the waters. Well, God having control of the waters is a running theme throughout the Bible. I mean, from creation all the way through. So God being able to exert his will over what to Israel would have been an unconquerable force. They had, they look at the sea and they see something that's completely wild. It's, it can't be conquered.
Right.
And so God having control over that with just a word is a thing. Then you get to this, it could be a sea serpent, who knows? That Isaiah 51 passage is pretty interesting, but the name Rahab or Rahab means pride. And so God crushing pride. Again, the running theme throughout Scripture. Genesis, you have the original with the serpent and the prediction that he would be crushed. And you go all the way to Revelation, you have a serpent being crushed, who is speaking blasphemies and pride as a theme, and God overcoming that pride and his people enduring through that. I mean, you can just see it. You see it in Egypt, you see it in all the kingdoms that pop up, you see it in Rome, you see it all over the place. So, I mean, it kind of seems thematic for Israel throughout Scripture.
Right. Yeah. Thank you. I appreciate that. So I knew somebody out of this group who has much more knowledge than I do. Would be able to save me on that one. So
Educated guess.
yeah, very educated, we'll say. Well, thank you. I appreciate it. Any other thoughts about the little section before we move on? All right. Let me get my place again. And talking about the right hand, I said we would reference that a little bit more. So that this next section, 11 through 14, really focus when I read through this about the mighty arm of God and the strong right hand. It says, again, 89:11, the heavens are yours, the earth is also yours. The world and all it contains, you have founded them. North and the south, you have created them. Tabor and Hermon shout for joy at your name. For you have a strong arm, your right hand, or your hand is mighty, your right hand is exalted. Righteousness and justice are the foundation for your throne. Loving kindness and truth go before you. So he is restating that no other God could create and sustain the earth here, or in the entire known world. The heavens except Yahweh. That is what the psalmist is again signifying. And this signifies the fullness of the earth from the north to the south, the whole completeness that God sustains everything. But it talks about this mighty arm, strong hand, that those are always associated with great power, especially when we think about the right hand. And this is, I always think about where did Christ sit once his work was complete? He sat at the right hand of God. And so I still see parallels every time I read right hand, verse 13, your right hand is exalted. I feel like that is more kind of prophetic and leaning towards Christ, where Christ is the right hand, he is exalted, and God's righteousness and justice, that's the foundation for this throne. No other throne could last and could sustain this entire earth without the righteousness and justice that God exhibits. And so, how does that really differ from the earthly rulers that we have now and that we have always seen? Do they always exhibit these characteristics of righteousness, justice, mercy? Or when was the last time that you saw somebody run like the campaign slogan was righteousness, justice, and mercy? You don't really see that. Those are kind of the characteristics that I guess earthly rulers try to run on now, or ever have really. So we just see this stark contrast between our Creator and the creation. And then I think about the mercy of God at the foundation of the church as well. That at the true foundation, God's mercy. Without God's mercy, there is no Christ. Without Christ, there is no church. So we see that being a cornerstone as well of the church. Any thoughts on that section?
Go back. If they work like good work, like we don't The one thing I can. But.
Yeah, that's a great point. Thank you. All right. Quickly running out of time, so we'll go to 15 through 18. It's how blessed are the people who know the joyful sound. O Lord, they walk in the light of your countenance. In your name, they rejoice all the day, and by your righteousness they are exalted. For you are the glory of their strength, and by your favor our horn is exalted. For our shield belongs to the Lord, and our King to the Holy One of Israel. So we see the happiness in those who obey the Lord and those who know the Lord. You know, there's certainly a difference between knowing the Lord and obeying the Lord. As Jared said, you can know the right thing to do. Doing it is a complete different thing. We see the favor and the fellowship in God's presence, or the favor that we can have in that fellowship in God's presence, and rejoicing all the day in his name due to God's righteousness, and also being strengthened in him. As the psalmist, you know, he's continuing to bring this up, and we can experience his power and deliverance through God. When we think about a shield, you know, a shield is not an offensive weapon. You know, a shield is a defensive weapon. It provides protection, and the Lord being the shield of Israel, and also being their strength, because he is the Holy One, as it references here. And just think about, you know, just as the author is ascribing all strength, power to God, and it's also our responsibility to, again, limit ourselves, bring ourselves down, not have that type of pride, but to also ascribe those attributes like any of our strength and success to the glory of God alone, and do everything for the glory of God there. All right. So that kind of ends one of the first sections. And now the next one, it's 19 through 37. Obviously, we're not going to have time to get through all of that today. We'll give it we'll start it. So this is hope in God's covenant with David. And we'll read 19 through 24 real quick. So 19, once you spoke in a vision to your holy ones and said, I have given help to one who is mighty. I have exalted one chosen from my people, and I have found David my servant. With my holy oil I have anointed him, with whom my hand will be established. My arm will also strengthen him. The enemy will not deceive him, nor the sons of wickedness afflict him, but I shall crush his adversaries before him and strike those who hate him. My faithfulness and my loving kindness will be with him, and in my name my horn will be exalted. So again, here we see these verses, a summary of David, his time as king, and God's special interest in the ruler of his people, how he has exalted and chosen David from amongst the people. You know, God's entire plan to redeem mankind from this lost state came through his lineage. So this was God's choice. It's a very carefully, well-crafted choice that he made, and that decision in his mind, knowing throughout this time from David to Christ, there will be errors, there will be faults, and his resolve to correct with the rod, not completely destroy with the sword, due to his faithfulness. And that through this specifically chosen and anointed David, that's who the Messiah would come from. It makes sense that God would promise to strengthen, help, and fight for David. Because again, if God is not the God who just makes, created Adam and Eve and just hands off, from that point on, I'm not doing anything. I'm completely backing away. That's not our God. That's not the God that we serve. We have this God is active and works certainly in our lives and through David and all of the generations that followed there. And when it references in verse 19, you spoke in a vision to your Holy One. I was kind of reading some of that. Like, I don't know whether that was to David or to Nathan, since actually the prophecy went to Nathan for David. But we see this phrase, the Holy One, like in Isaiah, mentions the Holy One 25 times in reference to Christ. So I don't know if, again, that was a small allusion, if it was referring to David, kind of alluding him to Christ or not. It's, so some of these, the allusions are there, are more obvious than others, but that certainly could have been another one, being this a messianic book. In verse 19 again, David being the son of Jesse and not of nobility, three parallels that one commentator made between Christ and David, starting in 19, the similarities where David was chosen from the people, Jesus was extracted from the people, elected by God from among the people, and then exalted above the people. Christ was exalted above the people just as David was. And we see those blessings that David received from the Lord and shows God's faithfulness and mercy, but yet still trying to see that how David was the type for Christ, eventually coming. That makes sense. I hope I didn't muddy that too much. I'm good. You had nods, so good. Right. Yeah. Absolutely. And then when we think about where David did come from, so the difference in David and Christ was being that perfect sacrifice. David in verse 20, anointed with the holy oil. David was persecuted after the anointment. Christ was persecuted, obviously throughout his life and towards the end, even though he was the anointed king. Let's see. Sorry. Somehow some of my notes got left off, and so I've got half of them on my phone, and I've got the other half that are down here. So let me just read through this real quick. So again, David was a faint shadow of what Christ would have endured, and no one was victorious over David due to God's protective power. So also evil doesn't prevail against Christ through his resurrection. So even though we see, again, a parallel in these passages between those two. Any thoughts before we close? I've got a few more things, but I don't want to get into this next section because we don't have very long. But any thoughts on anything we've talked about?
Grant,
Yes.
what did you say you think the timing is on this?
As far as when it was written, so the best I could gather was that since Ethan was the author and more than likely he lived, this was the Ethan that was referred to as one of the singers who lived during David's time, probably written maybe during King Rehoboam's reign. So obviously after David's death and after the death of Solomon, but probably Ethan was an older man during that time. We know David lived was that from 1035 or give or take around 1035 to 970 BC. So probably sometime 30, 40 years after that.
Yeah, I think that fits with, with the idea of him being able to live that long, being able to see the potential destruction of David's line because, going through Solomon and then seeing what happened with Rehoboam.
Right.
Even it says, in the 5th year of King Rehoboam, that Shishak, king of Egypt, Rahab, came back and warred with them. And it's very possible to see that he would be as a wise man, being able to try to put all this in perspective.
Right.
And think, God, you're still full of faithfulness, loving kindness. I know you've got this under control, but my life is fleeting.
Yeah.
How long?
Right. Yeah. And especially like I said, being an older man, knowing that he probably didn't have long left and seeing this type of destruction. All right. Well, thank you. I appreciate it.